So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at a creationist that, to my memory, I've never covered before, Walter Veith. Walter was a lapsed Catholic, but then his daughter got sick. For some reason, Walter became convinced that she was demon-possessed and called a priest. Apparently, after the visit from the priest, she got better, and so Walter and his wife returned to being practicing Catholics. After a while, though, they started having doubts about Catholicism, and so became Adventists under the influence of a contractor doing work for them. After that, Walter became a creationist as demanded by Adventism, and had a rocky career in academia, since, he was telling lies to students. Anyway, he managed to have a full-length career in academia, although he bounced around for a bit. Now he's retired and spends his time doing pastoring stuff and lecturing about evolution and creation. He is here being interviewed for a show called LED Live, and this is the one and only episode of that show I've ever seen. So I don't have any opinion on the hosts, nor do I know their positions on any questions not addressed here. Anyway, let's see what another scientist who abandoned reality for emotional reasons has to say about the science that doesn't help him feel warm and fuzzy inside.
Welcome back to LED Live, everybody. We have a awesome special guest today. I know I say that every single time, but today is an awesome special guest. I'm very excited.
You know what, Scotty? Me too. Although, probably not for the same reason.
Walter Veith, thank you for coming by on our show.
It's a pleasure.
If you guys don't know who this guy is and his ministry, we're going to put some links in the description below.
I'm not putting the links in the description. If you want to go find Walter, I'm sure your Google Foo is sufficient.
You will be blessed by the amazing information that you guys have put out, and we're going to get into a topic that we haven't actually covered very much before. Have we actually talked about evolution at all?
Not that I remember.
No. Yeah.
Well, that probably means that our hosts, Scotty, Keith, and Kendi, won't know enough to give any pushback to anything Walter has to say. That doesn't really fill me with confidence, but okay, let's skip until Walter actually has something to say. Because really, I'm here to look at his points, not the intro of some hosts, none of whom I'm familiar with, and none of whom are the ones claiming to be knowledgeable about the topic.
Well, I was a professor in zoology, but my speciality was animal physiology, comparative animal physiology.
Well, that's kind of true. He was relegated to physiology after he was removed from being a biology professor for, teaching kids things we know not to be true. I don't know the degree to which physiology was his field back when he was still teaching general biology, but his shift to teaching physiology in particular was something that happened later in his career, well after his conversion to Adventism. Note that I'm just getting that from Wikipedia. It's not the best source, but also frankly, while the exact details of his biography are relevant, they're also not the most important thing. So for this purpose, I think it's fine. If you disagree, let me know what I got wrong or what Wikipedia got wrong about his life, and how you know. If it's compelling, I'll offer a correction.
So that gives you a pretty broad spectrum, and you can move into animal experimentation that even links onto the medical world.
Yep, in fact, at one point, he was hired on as just a researcher and not allowed to teach, presumably because he's actually good at things like experiments, data collection, and the like. I have long maintained that creationists are in fact capable of doing science, it's just that most tend not to.
So I also became a professor in medical bioscience.
That part I'm less sure about. But also, I'm done with his biography. His credentials exist, are fairly ordinary for someone working in a biology department, and I don't really care to contest his story of his biography. Let's get to the claims about science. So after a few more biographical details, the host Scotty asks him how he could be a biologist looking at the amazingness of creation and not acknowledging a creator.
There was no maker. Evolution doesn't allow for a divine foot in the door.
Yeah.
And here we get to our first lie. Evolution no more requires or precludes a divine creator than does the theory of universal gravitation, the oxygen theory of fire, the germ theory of disease, or atomic theory. Most Christians belong to Christian sects which do not require them to reject evolution or find science to be at odds with their teachings. Well, I'm not here to be anyone's pastor, prophet, priest, or anything like that. It is simply not the case that evolution demands atheism.
There is no creator, so whether you speak to the guys at Oxford or at Cambridge or any one of them, there is no room for deity in any of this. Everything has to be explained naturalistic.
So among Oxford and Cambridge biologists who accept evolution, none are theists. I find that very unlikely, but unsurprisingly, neither school really lists their faculty by religious affiliation, so I will use an American proxy. Francis Collins is a famous biologist who accepts evolution and is also very open about his Christian faith. He earned a degree and later taught at Yale University, one of the top universities in the former United States. Indeed, it has been ranked in the top 10 schools worldwide. So while I'm not really willing to go into a deep dive into the biology faculty at Cambridge and Oxford, the wider point that theists are not welcome in biology departments in top schools is just not true.
And yet each of them would go to court if anyone tried to put their name on their body of work. You know, they want the credit when it comes to research or anything that they created, but no credit to what they're observing.
What the hell is she talking about? Last I checked, Christians and atheists and most other people want to put their names on their work, and even when they don't, it's important that those assessing their work after it passes peer review have a way to contact the authors. So even if they did not want their names on their work, they'd be required to put it there anyway. What in the world does this have to do with theism?
Yes. Now, if you take people like Richard Dawkins, for example, he's a very outspoken evolutionist. He is against God in every sense of the word.
I mean, except for his weird insistence on being a cultural Christian and hating Islam with that as part of his excuse.
But he identifies as a cultural Christian.
Oh, I didn't know that's where Walter was going with it.
Interesting.
So that's very interesting.
I mean, not really. He wants to be a bigot, and Christian culture is full of precedents for bigotry. That's not to say that you have to be a bigot to be a Christian. You do not. But if you do want to be one, there's a fair chance you could find examples of your preferred bigotry in Christian history. It's not just a coincidence that the KKK is a Christian organization.
So I found that fascinating. But you wrote a book called The God Delusion.
Yeah.
I don't care about that book or about defending Dawkins. I'm pretty much as much of an anti-fan of the God Delusion as Walter is, although obviously not for all the same reasons. But I'm not here to defend Dawkins of all people, or his crappy philosophy writing.
I remember being in school, and of course we got a lot of evolution because I was a science major, and
Yep, you sure do get a lot of science when you're a science major. Keith is right.
you know, to read papers by Stephen Gould and people like that. And I would say most of my professors were professed Christians. They went to the Methodist Church or whatever. And
Which directly contradicts Veith's point that Christians aren't welcome on the teaching staff of universities. Scientists don't put their religion down on their papers. Their research stands or falls on the data, and the data isn't tagged with Methodist, Twelver Shiite, Karaite, Theravada Buddhist, atheist, or anything else like that. Your religious affiliation really doesn't matter in science unless you use it as an excuse to do bad science.
I remember sitting in one class, I think it was Biochem 2, and they were having a discussion. I usually just listened a lot.
It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt.
One lady, she said, you know, she was talking about being a Christian, but how she found evolution, there was so much overwhelming evidence that it was just undeniable. And I was like, wow.
Sounds like she was smart and did not allow her confirmation or in-group bias to cloud her assessment of the evidence from science. Good for her. And she is yet more evidence that you do not need to stop being a Christian in order to accept the evidence of biological evolution. Anti-evolution is not the Christian position. It is one position among many that Christians hold. Creationists, including young earth creationists, do not have a monopoly on Christianity.
To think that you have gone to that point, and I always had a hard time, like, how are you living with yourself, you know, sitting in both worlds? But
you just don't take Genesis 1 through 11 literally and recognize that it is a series of ideologies used by the ancient Hebrews to understand their relationship with God, as well as the relationship of other nations to their gods, the God of the Hebrews, as well as each other. It's really not that complicated. The only reason it might be complicated is if you just decided that Genesis 1 through 11 actually have to be historical no matter what, evidence be damned. You could just, you know, not do that.
in science, and this is one thing I try to clarify for people, is when, and you'd be able to speak to this, but when they talk about evolution being a theory, the word theory is used differently in science than it is in the general vocabulary.
Wow, it's usually I who have to point that out to creationists, and not them who point it out. Keith is completely right here. In common parlance, a theory is just a guess. In science, it is a well-supported explanation for a set of phenomena that connects otherwise disparate datasets into a framework that explains them together, predicts the outcome of future tests, and suggests new areas of research. It's not at all a guess, and it takes a lot of time and evidence for an idea to reach the level of theory. Theory is the highest level an idea can reach in science apart from perhaps the basic axioms that allow science to function at all, such as the regularity of nature.
We use the term theory kind of loosely, like, oh, it's just a theory, like it's some,
it's not really
like
true.
it doesn't hold a lot of weight. In science, theory holds a lot more weight than it would in just, everyday vocabulary. And so for them, theory is right before something becomes a law.
And then he screws it up. Theories do not become laws, nor do laws become theories. Instead, laws are incorporated into theories. A scientific law is a mathematical relationship that has been shown to hold true within the boundary conditions for the law, or at least within conditions that reasonably approximate them. For example, the second law of thermodynamics says that the energy available to do work in an isolated system must either go down or stay the same over time. That's a mathematical relationship between time and energy. Newton's law of gravitation says that all masses are attracted to each other proportional to the sum of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Those were never theories, and instead, the second law of thermodynamics is actually now part of quantum theory, as we can now explain why it occurs in terms of the interaction of subatomic particles, which is the kind of phenomenon dealt with by that theory. Newton's law of gravitation is now part of the theory of general relativity, which deals with the bending of spacetime caused by mass, which is the cause of gravity. And we know that under a wide range of speeds, masses, and distances, Newton's laws remains accurate within our ability to measure. Laws, as I stated, also have boundary conditions. For example, if a system is not isolated, then new energy can be introduced, and that energy may be able to do work in the system, which is why the second law of thermodynamics does not apply to all systems. Similarly, as previously stated, Newton's law of universal gravitation is valid within a certain range of masses and distances. But outside of that, we need a more complex but more accurate law, because we have violated the boundary conditions of the law. Some laws, such as the ideal gas laws, have boundary conditions that are technically never met, but that are met closely enough that we can still use them. The ideal gas laws, for example, assume that the particles that make up a gas do not interact with each other. We know that not to be true, but because their interactions are, under most conditions, very infrequent compared to their interactions with the walls of their containers, the conditions are close enough. So I hope that you can now see what a theory is, what a law is, and why one never becomes the other.
But fascinating, evolution has never become a law. Why?
Because it does not describe an interaction that can be reduced down to an equation with units and numbers. But then that's also true for the germ theory of disease. What law could you possibly derive from the fact that many diseases are caused by microscopic pathogens? You could certainly come up with some laws about pathogens or diseases, or things like virulence, etc., but none of those are the germ theory of disease. They're parts of it. Similarly, there are laws in evolution, such as the mathematical relationships between effective population size, genetic drift, and the likelihood of a neutral allele being fixed or lost in a population. That's not itself the theory of evolution, and it never will be, but it is a law and it is part of evolution.
Because there's never been enough evidence to consider it to be a law in science, like gravity.
Nope, it's because Keith here is making a category error. There has been plenty of evidence in evolutionary biology for laws, which is why there are laws, mostly in population genetics. But those laws don't have catchy names and aren't usually taught in high school. Although Mendel's laws of inheritance are, and those are also part of evolutionary biology insofar as their conditions are met. But let's see if Veith, who knows better, will correct him or not.
It's past the point of hypothesis. It's come to the point of theory.
Yeah.
But you must understand the mindset.
Nope, it seems he will not. Because why bother correcting scientific illiteracy while presenting yourself as a scientist in a public forum?
There is no God.
Yeah.
Weird, because Keith had just said that the mindset of most of his professors who were teaching evolution was Methodist or similar. Methodists aren't really known for not believing in God, so I guess Walter is just lying, or he doesn't believe Keith and is too chicken shit to say so.
Yeah.
So somewhere along the line, something had to come into existence.
Which is entirely outside the scope of the theory of evolution. Evolution assumes that life exists and makes no attempt to account for that fact. Similarly, the germ theory of disease assumes that both germs and hosts exist. It doesn't matter to the germ theory whether the germs and or the hosts were created by God just now, whether they evolved or what. They exist and they act in ways that are accounted for by the theory. Similarly, the theory of general relativity does not account for where mass or space come from. It simply describes and predicts their interaction. We as yet do not have a theory about the origin of life, although there are people working on many, sometimes mutually compatible hypotheses regarding it. But as far as the theory of evolution per se goes, it does not matter where the first life came from, only that it existed.
And the only plausible theory that we have is the theory of evolution.
Well, evolution is the only theory we have that explains biodiversity, but that's not the same thing as the origin of life. But also, in being the only theory, it is inappropriate to pretend in a classroom there is another option available to science until such an option is actually presented in a way that it can exceed the predictive and explanatory power of evolution.
So even if it fails on certain points, you have to prop it up with pillars in other places in order to make it stand.
But that's the thing. It doesn't fail anywhere. Sure, we don't know everything about the evolution of life on Earth, but that's not a failure of the theory, that's a lack of data. A failure of the theory would be a finding that contradicts the theory. There have been no such findings. That's why it's still a theory and not a former theory, like the luminiferous ether or the phlogiston theory of fire, both of which were theories that have since been overturned.
Because the alternative, God, is just too ghastly to contemplate.
Yeah.
Except that God, in the big G Christian sense, isn't the alternative. It's one among a potentially infinite number of alternatives. Maybe panpsychism is true and the universe as a whole just arranged itself into life. Maybe we're all just the dream of Azathoth. Maybe we're all Thetans imagining the messed universe into existence as a game. There is no dichotomy of evolution or the God Veith believes in.
Well, this coming into our world's existence in the late 1800s, right? Charles Darwin came up with this kind of a concept, and if he was really truly tutored by the devil, right?
I'm sorry, but,
Excuse me, the did you just say?
Darwin can't just be wrong. He has to be under the tutelage of Satan himself. Just as a reminder, when Darwin was on the Beagle, and for most of the time he was compiling his data and coming up with his idea of natural selection, he was a Christian. Granted, he was a Unitarian, which many Christians consider outside the fold or in, but only barely. But he certainly believed in God, and had some religious place for Jesus. Although exactly what that wasn't exactly the same as it is in more mainstream Christian groups. But he certainly was a believer. Do these guys and Kendi believe that it's either their version of Christianity or Satan worship as a dichotomy? Was Darwin tricked by Satan? How does being a pupil of Satan work? Are there pop quizzes? Does he give marks for attendance?
There must be a really good reason why that's brought out in the end of the world.
Christians have been predicting the end of the world now for almost 2 millennia. They've been wrong every time so far. I bet this guy is wrong now.
Yes. Well, why would you want to negate the book of Genesis?
That's not what people are doing. Scientists generally do not care about negating or confirming the book of Genesis. I've never met or heard of any scientist who got into science so they could disprove Genesis. Just like no one gets into NASA because they want to hide the flat Earth. No one goes into science to hide the young Earth. It's just that Earth isn't flat or young. Evolution is real, vaccines work, 5G isn't a laser weapon, we landed on the moon, and there is no such thing as chemtrails. The idea that there is some scientific conspiracy to hide the truth, TM, is just lunatic conspiracy talk. And fun fact, if you want to say that there's a conspiracy to hide the truth you advocate for, you will have to demonstrate the truth of your claim, but now also the truth of the claim that there is a conspiracy. Claiming a conspiracy only ever makes the job of providing evidence for your non-consensus view harder.
Because the Genesis book tells you about the beginnings, number one, and it tells you about the reasons for the state of the world, what happened in the beginning, the loss of certain privileges that were associated with creation.
I don't see how any of that is a reason to hide anything or to fake science or anything of the kind. Science is also incompatible with the stories of the prose Edda being literally true. Does Walt think that there is also an attempt in science to delegitimize the Eddas? What about the Vedas? Do scientists only try to delegitimize the Bible because they all secretly know it's true? That seems like a weird thing to do, since if I knew that a particular part of the Bible was true, I would live my life like someone who knew that, not like someone who didn't while trying to cover it up. What could I possibly hope to gain by doing that?
And then you have the book of Revelation, which is the antithesis to the book of Genesis.
That is definitely not how I'd put it. Revelation is an exhortation to Christians under the reign of Emperor Nero to stay faithful and trust that God will save them. It uses apocalyptic imagery to describe the situation as well as the deliverance of Christians from the Neronian persecution. It's not about the end of the world, it's not about today, and there's a good reason that it is not included in the prescribed readings during the liturgies of the Catholic or Eastern Orthodox churches. It's because when people get too into it, they come up with dumb shit that has bad consequences for real people. After this, he just keeps droning on and on about connections between Genesis, Revelation, and eschatological musings that are basically just things he's imagining. I don't really care about that, so we'll cut back when he has something more to say about science.
Now, when I was an atheist,
So, after he was a Catholic and before he had an exorcism performed on his daughter. Got it.
we used to embrace the religious people coming to our university and presenting creationist ideas.
I get that. It's like when I sometimes fire up Doom or Halo, put it on easy, and just relax by ripping and tearing or giving the Covenant back their bomb. Sometimes it's nice to just have some easy targets to shred. Of course, in the context of creationist yokels, it's more in the intellectual sense than in the sense of chainsaws, plasma rifles, and grenades. At least, I hope so. It's not okay to use lethal weapons on creationists just because they're creationists. You have to wait until they actually threaten you or others. You know, like by electing a narcissistic man-child who will act as a pawn for neo-Nazis and Christian nationalists as your next king. Just kidding. Or am I?
Because we had great sport taking it apart afterwards and ridiculing it.
Yeah.
As long as they're not ridiculing the student, just the ideas. The average creationist who just shows up at a university isn't a creationist because they're stupid or evil, like Walter here. They're just ignorant. No one should be mocked for ignorance unless it's willing. And that is not a good assumption to make about some kid who just shows up in your biology class. It's much more likely that, like me, they were lied to about science through their whole childhood. That's something that demands empathy, gentleness, and understanding. Until they show themselves to be intentionally dishonest, like the average professional creationist, they should be treated as victims of being raised by conspiracy theorists, not as originators or spreaders of conspiracy theories. Because let's be clear, young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, and intelligent design are conspiracy theories designed to move society towards Christofascism.
And in that way, we were very successful in changing the minds of students.
Well done, I guess.
I mean, we live in a very conservative country. I come from South Africa, and most people are religious when they come to the university. And within 3 years, we drive that out of them.
I'm skeptical of that. There's nothing incompatible about evolution and being religious. Sure, some religions are incompatible with that aspect of science, but others aren't. Then again, realizing you've been lied to by your religious leaders for your whole childhood isn't exactly the kind of thing that makes people want to stay in their childhood religion. But I feel like that's more on the creationists for lying than on the professors for dismantling the lies.
There was a statistical study of how this is actually achieved and how the mindsets are switched. And they have Christian organizations working at the university campus with students to convince them that evolution is correct and that they have to adopt a theistic evolution hypothesis.
Good, as they should. And hey, if you're a Christian looking for pro-science Christian material, I would suggest that you check out BioLogos. They are an evolution-accepting Christian ministry. They will show you how you can be a Christian who does not feel duty-bound to reject science. We need more such people in the world, especially at a time like this when vaccine hesitancy is spreading in Christian communities.
In order to fit into the world, otherwise you will be contrary to what is good science.
If by fitting into the world, Walter means accepting things for which there is good evidence, then I feel like Christians should strive to do that.
So the aim even of Christian organizations often is to divert the mind away from what Scripture says to what is a compromise between Scripture and human thinking.
There is a problem with this framing, and it's that Scripture doesn't say one thing. If you want to make the Bible say that the earth is flat, you can. If you want to make it say that genetics works by sympathetic magic, you can. If you want to make it say that salvation is by faith and not works, you can. If you want to make it say that salvation requires work, you can. If you want to make it say that Jesus is God, you can. If you want to make it say he's not, you can. If you want to make it say bishops should be married, you can. If you want to make it say that no one should get married, you can. If you want to make it say slavery is good, you can. If you want to make it say slavery is bad, you can do that too. Christian beliefs do not primarily come from the Bible. They come from the traditions of Christian groups, as well as the struggle to make the traditions and the Bible relevant to the people who use them as authorities. Most creationists think that the Bible says that slavery is wrong, that people ought to get married, that sex is good within that context and not outside of it. Marriage ought to be between a single man and a single woman, that bishops are something that Catholics made up, and that the earth is a sphere. it is trivially easy to make the opposite case for each of those points. So already, Walter's theology is at odds with much of the Bible, and in order to pretend it's not, he has to ignore or downplay much of what's in the Bible. He can do that with the creation stories, and he largely already does, since the Bible has multiple incompatible creation stories, and he ignores parts of them in order to create a harmonized version that isn't what the Bible says anywhere. The fact that other Christians are willing to deprioritize what he wants to prioritize doesn't mean that they're ignoring the Bible any more than he is. It's just that they don't find important what he does. But guess what? Many Christians historically, and at present, disagree with Veith about what's important, all while remaining committed Christians.
Yeah, if you break the confidence right in the beginning, this is just a fallible, made up story or whatever like that. I mean, the main religious entity, I saw a video clip of the Pope one time that was saying he believed in the myth or believed that creation was a myth.
It is. A myth is a story that explains how something came to be or explains the proper relationship between things and features divine agency prominently. It also often involves other fantastical elements such as talking animals. Even if the story is literally true, it's a myth.
And I was like, well, the guy who's touting, or the world is touting as the guy who should be the religious voice in the world, doesn't even believe that creation is real.
The Pope of Rome is the head of one branch of one religion. I don't know why any non-Catholic would think he speaks even for Christianity, never mind religion as a whole. I wouldn't ask the Pope what the Mandaeans think, or what the Baha'i were up to, or what observant Jews should or shouldn't eat, or what incense to burn in a Buddhist temple, or whether or not a shrine to the commie George Washington is appropriate. But further, the fact that a religious leader of the largest single sect of Christianity is okay with evolution should be evidence that Christianity and evolution are not in principle incompatible. And even if they were, that still wouldn't actually be an argument against evolution. It would just mean that any argument for evolution would also be an argument against Christianity, while arguments against evolution are still not actually arguments for Christianity, since there are many options that are neither evolution nor Christianity.
The Big Bang Theory is a Jesuit concept.
Interesting.
No, it's not. The person usually credited with the discovery of the Big Bang is Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest. While he did graduate from 2 Jesuit schools and did consider joining the Society of Jesus, which is the name of the organization to which Jesuits definitionally belong, he instead decided to become a secular or diocesan priest. The only connection between him and the Jesuits beyond just being Catholic was his early education. By that standard, I guess I'm a nun, since in high school there were a couple of nuns that were teaching, and the school was a former convent. Now, do Jesuits accept the Big Bang? I mean, I've never asked any of them, but I assume most of them do, and if they don't, well, that's silly of them. But again, that doesn't make it a Jesuit idea, so there is no legitimate way in which the Big Bang can be called a Jesuit belief or idea.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow is right. Walter just lied to Scotty's face, and he gave no pushback, no skepticism. He just swallowed it. Amazing.
So before we get into this,
it seems like we're already into this, but whatever.
I just have this weird question. You don't have to answer that. But are they blending humans and animals?
Who is blending humans and animals in what way? Also, humans are animals, so it's kind of like asking if someone is blending roses and plants. I have no idea what this could mean, and I bet that means that Walter is going to come up with something completely bonkers.
Are they blending them now?
Yeah.
Genetically?
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of impressed he asked for a clarification.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I saw a video where they were legislating it on a legislative lesson or level, and I was like, if they're legislating for that...
You got a citation for that? And no, saying EWTN isn't a citation.
That means they've already done it.
No, it doesn't. There's no reason that someone has to have done something in order for someone to seek to regulate or criminalize that thing. It just has to be foreseeable.
And they were like talking about you can't make more than 50% man and 50% animal. And I was like, wow. Okay, we don't have to get into that unless you want a show about that. Let us know in the comment section below.
Only if it comes with citations. After this, Scotty hands the floor over to Walter Veith, which is odd since I feel like he's had it this whole time. But whatever. I'm not in charge.
Well, why was I an evolutionist in the first place?
Probably one of the reasons anyone is. The evidence or trust in experts.
Same as Richard Dawkins, because of theological concepts that are placed into the minds of young people.
Dawkins is very clear in his many books why he accepts evolution, and it's not theological concepts. It's the overwhelming evidence from fields such as genetics, morphology, embryology, and paleontology. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend his philosophical work, but it's very clear to anyone who has read any of his books about science for laypeople that he has evidentiary, not dogmatic reasons for accepting evolution. Now, we can argue about his reasoning for then going on to reject God, but that's not the same thing. Accepting evolution and rejecting God are not logically required to go together, as we already know from the Pope, who was just mentioned.
My mother was a Lutheran, my father was a Roman Catholic, and the two religions before the 60s were on opposite sides of the pole. And I was taught that my mother, who was very sick, was going to go straight to hell because she didn't have the right religion.
Well, that's really shitty, and I wish that hadn't happened to Walter. No kid deserves to hear that about their parent. I'm not sure what it has to do with evolution, though.
So I was about 10 years or so old at the time, and so I rebelled against this God.
That seems understandable.
In actual fact, I should have rebelled against the teaching and not rebelled against the God of the teaching, but I rebelled against that.
I don't understand how that distinction is made. Because there's no obvious physical referent to point to when talking about God, the only referent that can be indicated is the bundle of beliefs about God. Now, I suppose that to some extent that means that every person who believes in God could be said to believe in a different God. I'd be willing to allow that if the conceptual packages that two people use as the referent for God are substantially similar, they have essentially the same God. But despite this, if you rebel against a teaching about God, you are rebelling against the God that those people believe in. I don't know how else it could be. Now, obviously, there is a similar God that Walter does believe in, but then I'm not sure how it could be that he rebelled against the God of Lutheranism, and that led to atheism on its own. His mother was, as he said, Lutheran, and presumably the God of Lutheranism wasn't going to send her to hell, so why not just be a Lutheran? Anyway, today the Catholic Church does not teach that other Christians go straight to hell, and have even started to soften on that in regards to non-Christians, especially those who have not heard the gospel, or who have some impediment to belief. I'm not really here for Catholic theology time, but I just thought that this bit in the story was interesting, and brought up a chance for me to talk about the fact that I think the word God essentially refers to a collection of beliefs, which may or may not be about an external entity that may or may not exist.
And so I would consider myself from probably the age of 10 or 11 as an atheist, not believing in God.
Cool, well, let's skip ahead until we get to some claims about science, or at least until we get to what he says brought him back. I'm not really here for Veith's autobiography.
I taught evolution at the tertiary level at university.
Now, this is important. He was teaching about evolution at the university level, at least according to him. Now, I haven't bothered to verify this, but I'm happy to simply take his word for it. But remember, that means that he had to know what evolution was about and what it wasn't. So if he later gets something very basic about evolution wrong, we know he's lying, not just ignorant. And if he's not lying about evolution and instead is just ignorant, then he must have lied about teaching evolution at a high level.
Did you recognize the inconsistencies then?
I don't even know what Scotty is asking. Which inconsistencies? If it's the inconsistencies within creationism, then yes. If it's the inconsistencies within evolution, I would submit that none have been put forth. But perhaps if that's what he means and Walter answers in the affirmative, then it is in view of inconsistencies to be brought up soon.
No, you would rationalize the inconsistencies. They were there. For example, the whole question of intermediary fossils.
I'm not aware of any question about intermediary fossils as a concept. I guess you could ask about particular ones, like you could wonder about how much time Sahelanthropus chadensis spent in the trees versus Australopithecus africanus versus Homo habilis. But that's not the kind of thing I would expect someone to sum up with a singular phrase, the question about intermediary fossils.
Intermediary fossils not being there.
Ah, well, there's a lie then. Intermediary fossils are all over the place.
You mentioned Stephen Jay Gould earlier in the conversation. Now,
Okay, get ready for a lie about Stephen Jay Gould.
Stephen Jay Gould came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium.
Well, he and Niles Eldredge came up with a hypothesis by that name, one that has largely been falsified, except for the bare fact that relatively long periods of stasis, followed by relatively short periods of somewhat rapid morphological evolution, characterize the pattern of evolution seen in many lineages, at about the genus and species levels.
You always give a fancy name to something.
Yeah, you want it to sound smart.
So that it sounds good. Now,
Punctuated equilibrium is not really that fancy of a name. Equilibrium means that things are steady and not really changing, except that the equilibrium is punctuated. That means it's not always there, and if something isn't at equilibrium, it's changing. So it's change interspersed with no change. It's about as simple as the name really could be.
basically, punctuated equilibrium was invented because of the lack of intermediary fossils.
Well, at the species level. For example, we're probably not going to find the fossils of the forms that link Canis lupus, the gray wolf, Canis latrans, the coyote, and Canis aureus, the golden jackal, anytime soon. On the other hand, if you want fossils linking, say, canids to ursids or felids, those are easy to find in the form of animals like amphicyonids, Proilurus, and Meiosis.
Darwin said that if intermediary fossils didn't exist, it was a good argument against his theory, and they don't exist.
Are you sure about that?
That's the problem. If they did exist, they wouldn't need punctuated equilibrium.
I guess it's time to tap the Gould quote sign. Quote, "We propose the theory of punctuated equilibrium largely to provide a different explanation of the pervasive trends in the fossil record. Trends, we argued, cannot be attributed to gradual transformation within lineages, but must arise from the different success of certain kinds of species. A trend, we argued, is more like climbing a flight of stairs, punctuated and stasis, than rolling up an inclined plane. Since we propose punctuated equilibria to explain trends, it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or stupidity, I do not know, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but they are abundant between larger groups. Yet a pamphlet entitled Harvard Scientists Agree Evolution is a Hoax states, the facts of punctuated equilibrium which Gould and Eldredge are forcing Darwinists to swallow fit the picture that Brian insisted on and which God has revealed in the Bible." End quote. That's from Gould's essay Evolution as Fact and Theory. So Walter is just lying about the late Stephen Jay Gould. Nice.
So what is punctuated equilibrium? Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that there is no gradual evolution that's visible in the fossil record.
At the species level, at least.
So there was a long period of stability, so everything looks the same, and then punctuated. Instantly, you had, because of some environmental circumstance or something, very rapid change.
He's forgetting that this also requires a smaller subset of the population to be isolated, so that effects such as the founder effect and genetic drift can come into play, and also so that the overall rate of molecular evolution can be higher. But hey, who cares about actually portraying ideas that you want to critique accurately, right?
And then back to equilibrium, where nothing changes.
No, it's where there's little to no morphological change. Molecular evolution is always ongoing at the genetic level. It's just that that's not going to fossilize.
So when you look at the fossil record, you don't see any change.
He said while actual images of transitional forms scrolled across the screen. Thanks for doing my job for me, editor of this creationist video.
You just see, okay, here are creatures, but they're fully formed.
I have yet to hear a creationist explain what they mean by fully formed. Evolution doesn't predict that creatures that are transitioning from, say, basal myosid carnivorans to, say, carnivore carnivorans should go through a stage where they are just a lump of non-differentiated flesh mulling around on the ground. In fact, on the rare occasions when creationists even explain what they would expect a transitional fossil to look like, they describe fairly ordinary organisms that I doubt they themselves would describe as not fully formed. Just saying this means Walter is lying about evolution. He's intentionally strawmanning it. If he taught it, he knows better. If he doesn't know better, then he never taught it.
How did they get there? Well, it was so rapid that the intermediaries got lost in the process.
I guess just not those ones that were on screen, though.
So
I went from a fish to a bird immediately.
No. And the fact that he thinks that is at least somewhat down to Walter lying about this. Now, I suspect Walter will in fact disagree with this assessment, as it's probably too blatant even for him to accept this version of punctuated equilibrium.
Well,
kind of an
not
idea.
quite to the fish to the bird, but let's say it from the fish to the amphibian.
Oh,
He's just lying. He's just f***ing lying. It's at most from the wolf to coyote, or from the lion to the tiger. If you want to see transitionals from fish to amphibian, acknowledging that both of these words are being used ambiguously and in their common and not technical sense, here we go.
gotcha.
And from the amphibian to the reptile. And from the reptile to the bird. And from the reptile to the mammal, etc.
Wow, look at that. We have transitional species for exactly the thing Walter was lying about. How shocking.
Now, being a comparative physiologist, of course, you also look at not only the anatomy of these creatures, but you look at the physiology of these creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure, that's true. But to pivot back to what he was saying, it's amazing to me that no one here even asks if there are any transitionals that have been put forth. They all just swallow this bukkake of lies like they're drunk at a party in college for the first time, and they can finally experiment without their strict parents cutting them off. Does the panel have absolutely no curiosity, no critical thinking skills, no sense of the need to not simply take any old asshole's word for it when he says things they like? Have none of them ever learned how to check for legitimate sources, or even just how to think logically? Honestly, this is tragic. To think that humans can be so horrible at the one thing humans are supposed to be exceptional at: thinking. You know, in a lot of versions of Christianity, the Imago Dei, or image of God, spoken about in Genesis, is less about humans physically look like God, and more about them sharing in his moral, rational, and creative capacities. If that's true, then these 4 humans are doing more to deface the Imago Dei than I think any atheist could possibly do. If God is real and humans are actually made in his image, I can't help but think that he must be weeping over these 4.
And the anatomy often dictates the physiology.
Mm-hmm.
Physiology is the study of how anatomy interacts in the functioning of an organism. It's basically always dictated by anatomy. It couldn't really be any other way.
And you can't just change the anatomy without changing the physiology.
Again, yeah, that's true, but then minor changes in anatomy cause minor and automatic changes in physiology. For example, if a mutation causes the digestive system to add an outgrowth, that'll change how digestion works. And we can see such things in ruminants, animals like deer, bison, giraffes, and pronghorn. But if the outgrowth, say, starts to increase the permeability of the membranes to oxygen, then it's a supplement to the respiratory system. That's a change to physiology. Then if it starts to increase oxygen intake and decrease digestive functioning, now it's starting to be a lung, which is a change to the anatomy and physiology. That's the very thing evolution is about.
So it gets very tricky.
I fail to see how.
Because there are whole enzyme structures, whole genetic sequences that have to change. When you change an anatomical sequence, you also have to change the metabolic sequence. For example, how do you go from a cold-blooded creature to a warm-blooded creature without changing the metabolism?
Well, you don't, but that's what being warm-blooded versus cold-blooded is. It's like saying you don't grow taller without lengthening your bones. Yeah, obviously. So metabolism at its most basic is essentially just a really slow fire. Organisms take in chemicals, break them apart, extract energy to power their own biological processes, and then the excess energy is released as heat, and there are waste products in the form of oxidized chemicals like CO2. At least that's how it is for aerobic respiration, and since there are no warm-blooded creatures that rely on anaerobic respiration, I'm going to ignore it for now. Essentially, being warm-blooded is just being able to do this metabolic slow burn fast enough that the organism can counter the loss of this waste heat to the environment, keeping itself warmer than its surroundings. It then usually will also have mechanisms to cool it off, but those are common to cold-blooded creatures as well. So yes, you need to change the metabolism in that you need to speed it up. But it does not need to fundamentally change. You don't need new enzymes or biochemical pathways. You just need to be more active with the ones you've got. Now, that's not to say that warm-blooded creatures won't evolve new metabolic processes, just that it's not core to becoming warm-blooded in the first place. There is no enzymatic or physiological barrier to the evolution of active thermoregulation that can keep an animal warm despite the outside temperature. But Walter knows that he can use a bunch of words that the idiots he's talking to don't know, and thus both sound smart and pretend to have proposed a problem for evolution.
Right.
All of these things must sort of develop simultaneously, and it's very, very complex.
Well, good thing that evolution is a process in which anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry change gradually from one generation to the next with incremental steps, and that multiple aspects of an organism can evolve in parallel, so it doesn't have to grow wings and then wait around for a high enough metabolic rate to actually be able to fly with them. Instead, things like aerodynamic capability and metabolic rate can evolve in tandem. It's almost like this isn't a problem in the least for evolution, and only by being ignorant or a liar could someone say it is. And since Walter apparently taught this stuff, I guess he's a liar.
But that's all you have.
If you know what the antecedent to the relative pronoun that is in the sentence he just uttered, please let me know in the comments. I can't figure it out.
So let's say you start off as a gradualist. That's Darwinism.
The thing is, the punctuated equilibrium is also gradualistic on human timescales. It doesn't involve hopeful monsters where a Tyrannosaurus lays an egg and out pops a bird. It would still take hundreds or thousands of generations to go from a coyote to a jackal, but creationists like to pretend otherwise in order to make punctuated equilibrium more or less the same as the old idea of saltationism, which did in fact propose that macromutations could cause huge morphological shifts in a single generation. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself. Walter hasn't actually done that yet, so let's give him a chance, even though based on his previous behavior, we have no reason to do so.
gradual change over long periods of time. That's called the gradualist.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't find the change happening in the fossil record, so you are compelled to become a punctuated equilibriumist.
No, you're not, because punctuated equilibrium is about a lot more than just the pace of morphological evolution. That's the part of it that has survived, but it's also the most trivial part. The actual meaty parts, such as group selection, have just not panned out and are not accepted by the scientific community. Plus, he's depicting this as a dichotomy, but it actually exists on a continuum. In some cases, like the genera Triceratops, Thalassocnus, and Homo, we actually have so many specimens that we can watch the transition from one species to the next through time, just as the extreme form of gradualism would predict. But for most other genera, like Panthera or Canis or Australopithecus, we can't do that, and instead is closer to what one might expect from the staccato evolution associated with punctuated equilibrium. But there are also cases in between. These are not ideas in opposition to each other. You don't have to choose one and reject the other any more than you have to choose to drive either 25 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour. In fact, you can drive at many speeds between those.
Which is a Stephen Jay Gould follower.
No, it's not, because science doesn't work like a revealed religion with prophets. Science doesn't have prophets, gurus, or sages. It has pioneers. But the only reason to follow what a pioneer says is if they're right. Gould wasn't right about most of the things he proposed, but he was right that the pace of evolution varies. That's why evolutionary biologists accept that, but don't accept most of the rest of the stuff he said. The same is true for Darwin. He was right about natural and sexual selection, but he was wrong about a bunch of other stuff. Stuff no scientists take seriously now, like blended inheritance via gemmules shed by the tissues of the body.
And you have these two schools of thought, and they're always at loggerheads with each other.
Wrong.
But you really have no option. You have to go that route.
What route? What does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know, they can't identify what's causing the punctuation. They just know it's happening, or they believe it's happening.
Of course they can. It's fairly easy if you know the basics of evolutionary biology. In large populations, evolution acts slowly as it takes a longer time for mutations to spread. Also, because the larger the population, the more sensitive natural selection is, a large population will tend to be optimally suited for its environment. That is, it will occupy a peak on the fitness landscape, and provided that the environment does not change much, any significant morphological change will of necessity lower the fitness of the individual, and with the very high sensitivity of natural selection, such variations will not persist long at all. Therefore, a large population in a static environment is predicted to arrive at a morphological and physiological optimum, and then just stay there. But if part of the population wanders into a new area and is cut off, and the new area has a different environment, then suddenly evolution can happen more rapidly in the smaller population. Natural selection will favor a different morphology and physiology, and the founder effect will mean that both neutral and non-neutral variation is not at the same frequency as in the original population. All of this adds up to rapid morphological change. If the new, smaller, changed population is able to go back into the environment of the original population and thrive, then in the fossil record it will look like one species was there all along, and then suddenly a very similar but distinct species appears. That really is like high school level evolutionary biology.
Oh, they'll
how
say
they
there
explain
was
it.
a rapid environmental change.
That's actually more likely to result in either extinction or more gradualistic evolution if the period of the environmental change is actually recorded in the fossil record. But it could also just result in the appearance of an entirely new species if the rapid change is not recorded.
Global warming could do it, you know what I mean?
I see.
Why deny one part of science when you can deny basically all of it, right? But also, yes, global warming is already resulting in extinctions and will result in rapid evolution in those species that manage to cling on through it.
You know, I did these things come up, Christianity, in the conversation, and does the whole group just be like, no, be quiet. We're not going to even
And then
talk
why
about
discredit?
I don't see why it would. Science isn't what is in opposition to Christianity. It's just following the evidence. What the Bible says is completely irrelevant, as are the religious beliefs and practices of anyone doing science, provided that they don't bias their data gathering or interpretation based on those beliefs and practices. The proper amount to talk about Christianity, or any other religion for that matter, in a biology class is none.
And then
Talk
why
about
discredit things like the flood? You
Yeah.
know, that punctuated
Yeah.
event.
Well, if every proposed flood model weren't physically impossible, and if the sedimentary rocks of the Phanerozoic didn't include many layers that were definitely not laid down by a flood, then I'm sure it would come up. But as it is, it's as valid a thing to discuss in a science classroom as the flat Earth. In other words, the only reason to talk about it is as something we now know to be wrong, but the people used to think was true, and that a few nutters still think is true. despite all the conclusive evidence to the contrary.
We'll talk about everything, like with the planet was seeded by animal or aliens and all sorts of stuff like this. Like, we'll entertain some pretty wild things, but not Christianity. Nope.
I'm not aware of any actual widespread acceptance of panspermia in biology, but it has the advantage of being consistent with physical laws as we know them. God is not, basically by definition, which means that while panspermia is an idea open to scientific inquiry, God magic is not. Further, young Earth creationism, to the extent that it is actually open to scientific inquiry, has failed every single test. We know it's wrong. Now, I don't conflate that with Christianity, but it seems that Scotty here does. I think that's a bad move on his part, but technically, it's none of my business.
Leave that off the table.
Oh, they actually do entertain alien, but not in the sense of alien beings.
I'm not sure where he's going here. Alien beings are certainly at least a possible vector for the interstellar spread of biology.
Although the metaphysical world will go there and say that alien beings interfered in the evolution of humanity.
I guess the History Channel has been rebranded to the Metaphysical World. Probably a better name for them.
They made the punctual something.
But
They had a machine.
Let's leave that out.
Yes, let's. Just like basically all of the scientific community, for whom it's just a fun thought experiment and not an actual serious consideration, since it makes very few, if any, testable predictions, all while being at least physically possible, unlike most of young Earth creationism.
They will have a theory that if it didn't happen here because it couldn't happen here, it must have happened elsewhere.
I mean, that does not seem to logically follow. There was a time when there was no life on Earth, and now there is. Something changed that. If it didn't change by life coming about on Earth, there aren't many other options than life came about elsewhere. But origin of life researchers are not exactly despairing of the possibility that life started on Earth. So this whole topic is mostly irrelevant to anything going on in science.
And that theory is called panspermia.
Interesting.
It's not a theory, it's not even really a hypothesis. It's just a thought some people have had, and it's not logically or physically impossible that we know of.
Panspermia, so it was spermed from out of space.
Did he just use sperm as a verb? I do not like that at all. Let me know in the comments if you also heard him say spermed like it's a weak verb, or if it was just me.
So you can't get a molecule to form naturalistically, so it must have happened out of space where there were different conditions. You don't exactly know how.
You can't prove it.
And I came here via a meteor, and boom, then they were there and they could be incorporated. That's how it works.
Yeah, a few things. Scientists know of plausible naturalistic mechanisms to get lipids, amino acids, sugars, and various polymers of more than one kind, all in ways that are relevant to prebiotic Earth. But we have also detected complex chemicals in space, including sugars and alcohols. So we don't need space for abiogenesis, but even so, it looks like important aspects of prebiotic chemistry happens there too, resulting in not a problem for the origin of life, but us being spoiled for options.
Yeah, that's the irritating part. There's a lot of stuff that can't be proven,
Fact
which science is supposed to be about proving duplicatable experimentation, right? And so much of this is not.
Yeah, and on that list are supernatural events of any kind, a worldwide flood, separate ancestry, all animals originating in the Middle East, etc. None of those things can be verified or repeated, and most of them we know couldn't possibly have happened. That pot really does seem fixated on calling the kettle black, even though the kettle is really a teal color that's slightly discolored at the bottom because of scorch marks. And now I realize I kind of miss my old kettle. Aw, now I'm sad. Oh well.
Yes, so you have to have these prop theories in order to explain what's inexplicable.
Yeah, see, that criticism only works if panspermia is actually a mainstream or even consensus idea about the origin of life. But it's not. It isn't really being seriously investigated. It isn't talked about in general by origin of life researchers. In fact, creationists talk about it more than I've ever heard actual scientists talk about it.
And here's what's crazy is it's like, you know, they're so not willing to just say, hey, look, Christianity to me makes a lot of sense when you listen to it.
A lot of biologists are and have been Christians, so yes, they are. Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists there is after Darwin, was himself an Eastern Orthodox Christian. Joel Duff, an evolutionary biologist, fellow counter-creationist, science friend, and friend of the channel, is a Christian. Bob Bacher of paleontological fame is also a Christian preacher. Francis Collins, a medical professional and man who accepts evolution, is also famously Christian. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, the person who first found soft tissue remains in a T-Rex femur, is a Christian who is very open about how she loves the Lord. Nothing about evolution precludes Christianity, even if it precludes Scotty's version.
At least everybody needs to be honest and come to the point and say that they're both approaching their worldview by faith.
Yeah.
Nope. I don't see what about science requires faith. That just sounds like he's trying to put his faith on par with evidence-based empirical knowledge, which it's absolutely not. Look, things aren't wrong because they're believed by faith. But nothing in science needs to be believed by faith. There is ample evidence for any of the firm conclusions of science to negate the need for faith. But hey, I think this is a good place as any to take a break and come back later. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content, if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovend, Furevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostic Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabby Babby, Sphincter of Doom, Vollus, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.